Thank you, Lisa. Do you have cable at home? Does your family subscribe to cable? If you do, or if you've ever even watched cable, then if you've done very much of that, no doubt you have seen some TV preachers, right? And if you've watched very many of the TV preachers, then no doubt you have encountered some that are called prosperity preachers, or they preach a gospel known as the prosperity gospel, sometimes referred to as word of faith. And if you hear these guys, you'll recognize them because their message is often very much the same. They'll say things like, God wants you to be rich. He doesn't want you just to be reasonably wealthy. He wants you to be fabulously wealthy, like exponentially rich. Not only that, but he wants you to be healthy. In fact, God never, ever wants you to be sick with anything, ever. And also, God wants to promote you to great positions of prominence and power and authority. He wants you to be a very significant person. And God wants you to make you famous, world famous even. And God never wants you to have any problems or struggles or hardships in this life. That's the message. Those are the kinds of things that these prosperity preachers say all the time. They say that these are the things that God has promised you, and you can have all of this and more if you will simply believe God for them. And then they offer the service of teaching you the technical ways of using your faith to do that. Well, you know what I think is interesting about the prosperity preachers? What I think is really rather fascinating, if not ironic, is that they're right. They're right. That is what God wants for you. God wants you to be rich and famous and healthy and significant. In fact, he wants all of that for you and more. But you know what else I find fascinating about the prosperity preachers is that they're wrong. Oh, they're right about what God wants for us. They're right about God's desires. They're right about God's will. But they're wrong about his timing. It's a critical issue of the timing of these things. Today we're in Hebrews chapter 11. Pastor Jeff preached on this very chapter last week, called it the Great Hall of Faith. And it pointed out that there's a lot of history of the Old Testament retold in this chapter, chronicling all these details of particular characters who are held up as a model of great faith for us to emulate. Well, what I'd like to do is to choose a few of the men, the great men of faith listed in chapter 11, and I want to contrast the difference between what God wanted for them, his desire, his promise to them, and what actually happened in their life on earth. So let's begin with Abraham, the patriarch himself. What is it that God wanted for Abraham? Well, God wanted Abraham to be a patriarch not only of a large family, but of a great nation. And he wanted to give Abraham a huge plot of prime real estate. And then he wanted to pour out so much blessing into Abraham's life that it would just overflow to the entire world. That's what God wanted to do in the life of Abraham. That was his promise to Abraham. But what actually happened in his life? Well, as Pastor Jeff pointed out last week, Abraham died with no land. Or as he said, a tiny, tiny little bit of land, almost nothing. And he only had 2 children, hardly a great nation. And for hundreds of years, his descendants were not considered a blessing at all, but rather a curse. And they were perpetually persecuted for that and are to this day. And it would be hundreds of years before his descendants would become a great nation. And it would be even later before they would receive the land that they had been promised. And after that, it would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more years before they could be a blessing to the whole world by providing the Messiah. So the fulfillment of that promise was late in coming, certainly for Abraham. What about his son, Isaac? What did God want for Isaac? Well, essentially the same things. God wanted Isaac to have millions of descendants and to live in the land flowing with milk and honey. And what actually happened to him? Isaac died with 2 sons and no land. All right, well, how about his son, Jacob? God wanted the same things for Jacob. He wanted him to live in the land of promise, and he wanted his descendants to be a blessing to the entire world. But what actually happened? Jacob had 13 sons, 12 of whom were not a blessing to anyone, especially Jacob. And he also died with no land. Okay, well, let's fast forward several hundred years. We'll take Moses. What did God want for Moses? Well, God wanted Moses to liberate his people from bondage in Egypt, to lead them into freedom, and then to live with them in the promised land. But you know what actually happened. Moses spent the last 40 years of his life leading a grumbling and ungrateful Israel around and around in the desert. And then he died just before they received their promised inheritance. You see, God had a plan and a desire to give each of these men a great inheritance. And yet, for all of these men, death came before the fulfillment of the promise did. The promise was real, make no mistake, and it would be fulfilled. But not here. Not yet. Okay, that was the Old Testament saints. What about the New Testament saints? Or let's fast forward all the way to today. What about the present day saints? What about us? I'd like us to consider what we have been promised and what God desires for us, and contrast that with what actually takes place in our lives. For example, God wants you to be rich. He wants you to be extraordinarily wealthy. And I'll build a case for that in a moment, but for now, just take that on faith. God wants you to be rich. But what's likely to actually happen? Well, most likely, most of us will die somewhere in the middle class, upper, middle, lower, middle class. Some of us will die in poverty. Secondly, God wants you to be healthy. In fact, he wants you to be perfectly healthy. God doesn't even want you to suffer from a mild headache, ever. And he doesn't ever want you to die, ever. And yet, what's likely to happen? Well, all of us will experience various degrees of sickness and pain. Some of us will suffer from chronic pain, perhaps all our lives. Some of us may die from an incurable terminal illness. But really, whether you get very, very sick and die, or whether you stay very, very healthy and die, you still die.